Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We're talking about what scares people, and we're not talking about what's growing at the back of your fridge.
This episode is for the people who say there's nothing scary in the Ozarks, which sounds like denial to me, and also for the people who know exactly what scares them.
The Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or just about any podcast platform. We'll be right back to everything creepy and frightening, but we want to let you know where you can find us in person in the next few weeks. You can purchase tickets for our events at paranormalsciencelab.com.
And you can join us at the Metaphysical Fair at the Old Town Event Center in Republic, Missouri. This weekend, Friday through Sunday, November 11th through 13th. Visit selfdiscoverycenter.com for more. And on November 19th, we have two events. First, in the afternoon, we will be at Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, signing books and talking about everything in the Dark Ozarks. This is a free event.
Then the night of November 19th, we'll be doing a tour and paranormal investigation of the Webb City Public Library.
Find all the details for the events at paranormalsciencelab.com. And Dark Ozarks t-shirts are now for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
What is scary, whether it's paranormal or not paranormal?
It might be serial killers, outlaws and gangsters, ghosts, urban legends, monsters.
There's too many possible answers there, but we will tell you our favorites later in the show.
Let's start there as soon as we give a shout out to our great sponsors that help us bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
We encourage everyone to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and their website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, it's haunted. Tell Bob and Elise we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and food in a historical building with a noir past, and the building is also haunted.
The Ozarks has seen plenty that scares you, especially in those silent moments in the dead of night when you're alone with your thoughts. So what is your favorite scare?
There are, of course, things that you know are real and those things that you might have doubts about. The question of whether you can dismiss something as fictional or silly might make it all the scarier.
Those questions of doubt bring up the paranormal.
That they do. And that we've seen that happen for a lot of people, especially a lot of people. Of course, we have had our perhaps initiatory moments as well. They were a while back.
Just a wee bit.
Yeah. But we get to witness individuals experiencing their initiatory moments at times.
That's true. And there's something about when you see that light bulb go on someone's face at an event when they realize their worldview just changed.
And that doesn't get put back in the box.
No, the toothpaste is out of the tube at that point.
The key word that you used right there to me is worldview.
And I really do think that that's accurate, because a lot of what we tell ourselves is scary and our reactions to things is based on our worldview. And that varies from person to person.
It does. Now, something I was thinking about is particularly, well, first, that this scraping away of the realities of the supernatural is synonymous with mid-century modernist society.
Yes, everything has a box. Everything has a rational, objective explanation. And if it doesn't fit in its box, it just doesn't exist.
I think even further than that, not only does it not exist, but that cannot exist.
True. And that for anyone who has a different worldview, there are pretty heavy connotations assumed for that person, that either they are unsophisticated, uneducated, just foolhardy, or gullible.
I think that's a really good point there. And this appears to be the basis for the stigmatization that society almost unconsciously has applied to individuals who have experienced hauntings.
That's true, but there's a funny juxtaposition with the timeline, because as you said, a lot of that did come about mid 20th century as we came out of World War II, and sort of our eyelids are peeled back with the reality that we could destroy the world in a second during the Cold War. But at the same time, in the early 70s, there simultaneously became the beginnings of more of the, I don't want to say obsession, but very acute interest in the paranormal again.
It didn't take long.
No, and it coincided, really, sort of the jumping off point really is The Exorcist, and then some other movies and books in that timeline, but mainly The Exorcist. And if people are wondering, oh, that's just hype or whatever, it really isn't. People were fainting in theaters. And so, but I almost view it as a natural consequence to that modernist view, convincing ourselves that this is all foolishness, and then being presented with, albeit a piece of art in the form of a book and a movie, presented in a way that makes it less safe, that, oh, this could happen no matter how outlandish it seems. And so without that modernist conformity for the 20 years before that, I'm not sure what happened.
I think that's a very good point. And as we were talking, the Night of the Living Dead, the original, came to mind. But what is very interesting about that film, and I think that art is extremely important in these discussions of culture.
I agree.
That Night of the Living Dead, there is an oblique reference to a meteor falling that is assumed to have initiated the reanimation of the corpses within this county. Consequently, while certainly there's a bit of Lovecraftian cosmic horror that is implied with that, it is not out of the realm of hypothetical science. This horrific event is still conceptually being contained within an idea of science and nature, albeit very horrifying, but still not the implied existence of supernatural or paranormal.
Exactly. And so that does differentiate it from The Exorcist. And because that modernist rational framework doesn't work in analyzing The Exorcist.
Correct, which is both terrifying, but also rather enchanting in a unique sort of way.
It is. especially now the flip side to that is what most people didn't know at the time was that it was based on true events. And so that makes it even more complicated.
It does. And interestingly enough, true events that have a tie to the Ozarks borderlands.
Yes, they do.
And I think we'll get into that the specifics of that a little bit later, but in this episode.
Yes. So that's sort of where this dichotomy of thought started. And it's just a intertwining of those two notions since that everything has to be rational, but there is a undercurrent of fascination by and fear of all that is paranormal or supernatural, to the point of grown people fainting in a theater.
Yes. And grown people sometimes screaming on a tour.
Yes, that has happened a few times. Or grabbing onto one of our arms and not letting go, things like that.
It reminds me, I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to give an off-the-cuff tour of the Old English Inn.
Mm-hmm.
And up on the mezzanine level, lovely couple that I had the opportunity to visit with. And we were talking, and one of the first things that I noticed was that the couple, particularly the woman, was very, very nervous. And so I gave her my impressions of the inn and my thoughts about interacting with the paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
And this episode is a bit different than our regular fare, because so much of what we deal with the paranormal feels normal.
Oh, and, at least to us.
Yeah, precisely to us. I should clarify. It feels normal to us and doesn't feel scary. I was thinking about this when we were discussing our topic, because in terms of what scares me, there have been times that I have certainly been scared, but that hasn't happened in a long time. And in so many cases, my experiences with the paranormal are not scary. They actually feel comforting, normal, everyday, more at home in a haunted house than in a big box department store, exponentially.
Same here.
And that does, of course, make it interesting in terms of doing research for the episode, because the things that frighten a lot of people, including, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, because these are individuals who we're interacting with at events, who they are spooked out, they are frightened, they are nervous or agitated to some level that something paranormal is going to happen. And while obviously they have a great deal of interest because they went to a considerable effort to be at the event, at the same time they are afraid. That's
true. Of course, human beings are known to do that anyway. I mean, we go to spook houses for that reason, watch slasher films for that reason.
Oh, so true. And something that is an interesting point of intersection. We've talked about real life serial killers, very dangerous individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if one of those very dangerous individuals dies and ultimately becomes part of a haunting, that does change the potential nature of the activity within a building. or
That
location.
that's true, and I think that does account for some hauntings that seem to be less comforting, less normalized than others. And even if they weren't a serial killer or something, just someone that is a jerk in life or tends to be the same afterwards as well.
And this might be an interesting point for just this overall discussion. Nice, quote unquote, is highly subjective.
That's true. And those experiencing behavior can read something a lot of different ways. For instance, probably the most common electronic voice phenomena that is caught, besides hello, is get out or go away. And that often will frighten people when that happens. I think because they assume something bad's about to happen. And often in context, it seems that whoever you're communicating with just doesn't want to be bothered, just go away. Not as a threat, but just either boredom or non-interest or something else.
Highly irritated and frustrated ghost crying in the closet, just wishing that you would leave.
That's right. That's right. But that seems to get proportionately a very exaggerated reaction from people. Almost more
Well,
than any other audible.
For good reason. And I think oftentimes the investigations that we know about or are exposed to when this happens is they're for example, a family, etc., could be experiencing this sort of phenomena in their home, and they're going, this is also our home, we can't leave.
Right. And that does happen, and that can be very frightening. But generally I'm talking about in sort of that public setting where it's not a home, not your home either, but just hearing get out. Boy, if it were that easy to get rid of salesmen and other unwanted guests, if they could see you, but just be disembodied voice, and it works.
Comes in very handy during the holidays.
Yes. That's just something that has struck me as so disproportionate to the reality of what typically is going on.
And coming back to the fear aspect, I think a big part of it is a sense of powerlessness.
Very true. Very true. And I think that will apply to a lot of the things that we discussed tonight as far as what scares people is the sense of powerlessness, or not knowing enough of the situation to adequately respond, perhaps.
And in any situation, not just paranormal, but these are frightening situations for human beings to be placed into, or to become aware of. I think we are often in situations for which we're unprepared, or in situations in which we are potentially in danger, but if we're unaware of it, then we don't know to be frightened.
I agree. What types of paranormal activity do you think really create the most fear?
Well, ever since the movie Poltergeist,
I'm afraid of TV sets.
TV
Or
sets.
digging a pool in my yard, but
Um, thanks to Poltergeist, there is just an understanding that you probably don't want to leave the TV on static overnight and stare at it. And you also, it is universally understood, I believe, that unmarked graves are a bad idea.
yes. And I mean, and if you want to take that modernist rational view, it doesn't make much sense, especially when you consider that for hundreds, thousands, at least a couple thousand years in Europe, particularly, no one expected to have a permanent grave.
True. It's very much a comparatively new idea.
And a North American idea. And so that is something that I think you will have a different reaction, fear reaction, or repulsive reaction for people in North America versus Europe. Because space has been limited for burials for so long that typically, for most people, they got 3 years and then the bones removed.
Well, and that reminds me of one of my favorite fiction pieces from mid-century, that October Country, that deals with the potential exhumation of bodies in a rural Mexican town, where if you don't pay the toll, that the bodies get placed in a dry cave until you can pay enough money to have them put back where they belong, in the sacred ground of the churchyard.
Yeah.
And that the inspiration for that particular short story, which is quite unsettling, and I would highly recommend that you get a copy of October Country to check it out, is a real town in Mexico that was a common practice.
Yes. And it's a visceral image, but one that in Spain probably wouldn't have caused people to bat an eyelash.
Which is quite possible. And there's this very interesting dichotomies that tend to intersect in, again, mid-century North America, specifically US and Canada, as you move forward. And one is the exorcism, if you will, of the paranormal from polite conversation.
True. Just as, it was not polite to talk about politics or religion, you just didn't mention those things.
Just don't bring up the ghost. Just whatever you do, don't bring up the ghost. And as you noted, as the pressure, so to speak, tamped down on this is something you don't talk about, the more important it was, or the more resonant art, particularly in the form of film, but not limited to film, became a very powerful point of catharsis for individuals. And I think on two levels. One, and we continue to see this, individuals who have had real experiences, and oftentimes they rely on pop culture, the medium of pop culture, in an attempt to explain their experience or contextualize their experience in some way.
We find that a lot with people we interact with, that their own experiences they had, that they will explain them in context to say the ghost hunting shows.
Yes. And then I think another point of intersection, not for individuals who have had specific experiences, but for individuals who, for whatever reason, perhaps their sensitivity setting just was genetically a little higher, perhaps their ancestral background, perhaps a lot of things, but individuals who are predisposed to a greater level of sensitivity, it appears that they it's a bit like, making another film reference, it's a bit like The Matrix, that as Morpheus noted, the splinter in your mind, that you know that the world that you're being told is not all there is.
Yeah, a very good analogy, actually. Yes, agreed. I think that I think what people fear the most about the paranormal continues to change as well. It seems that used to be a fascination, say, in the 1800s, early 1900s, of the focus was on personal messages. And well, A Christmas Carol is a good illustration of that. But now it's a fear of direct interaction, sort of that close encounter of the third kind, but with a ghost instead of an alien.
That's a good point. And not specifically the topic of, well, there's enough crossover that alien encounters are not, in some cases, not dissimilar to the paranormal events, in the idea that some individuals find it personally terrifying, or a sense of terror that is directed from their perception appears to be directed at them.
Yes, and again, I think it's a loss of control and a sense of helplessness, because particularly if they have an abduction experience, that they had no say so in what happens, and that's probably the main common denominator of fear for all of these things. Whether it's paranormal, whether it's something that's really happened in history, etc., is just that sense of lack of control.
It is, and for good reason. We like to be in control. We like to physically be in control, and we believe that being in control is not only important, it's part of our human rights. And then occasionally something comes along that doesn't seem to care about that.
Yes. Or just makes it obvious that we are not in control of our lives and destiny as much as we think we are.
Yes. And that's oftentimes it's a little bit of a delayed response, but it comes down to this upending of our worldview. And for some, that can even go as far as full-on existential crisis.
Very much so. I think the best examples I've observed do tend to be involving people experiencing, say, scratches.
Yes. And that often gets equated with demons by the public.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, and that assumption has been fostered by a lot of pop culture as well. Although it doesn't really make a lot of sense, particularly as initial activity. Demonic cases that have been certified by the church, if you get to the point where you're having scratches or things appearing on skin, you're usually quite far down rabbit hole and a number of months into things before that happens. And I think that is maybe one of the most sort of that irrational fear responses that people have, that they completely throw out rational thought and assume the absolute worst, instead of thinking through that if this is something evil, if this is something with high intelligence, with the ability to manipulate, they're not going to announce themselves that way.
Right.
You know, it's like well, the example with that comes to mind from my other life as an attorney is with domestic violence, is that well, why in the world is the victim with this person, etc., or how they end up staying with them or marrying them, etc. Well, you know, if the perpetrator gave him a black eye in the first date, there wouldn't be a second date. It's right. It's the same thing. I mean, but that is something that rational thought really seems to go out the window immediately for so many people, that, oh, it has to be the absolute worst case scenario of a haunting. Just the idea that you have this omnipotent being saying, okay, I'm going to give you an autograph as soon as I meet you, basically.
There's a number of things that I'm thinking about right at the moment. First of all is the reality of being gaslit by demonic entities. And I'm probably not going to be the same now that I have that idea in my head. That's one. Two, for an individual that does experience on a tour, et cetera, or an investigation, that they do get scratched. And that does happen on occasion.
It does on occasion.
It's not out of the realm of reason. And the other side of this is individuals who may not be familiar with sort of our burgeoning paranormal culture in terms of pop culture, reality TV, etc., might, even if they were told, oh, you might get scratched, etc., by an entity, there easily could be plenty of people who are like, no, y'all made that up, because this stuff doesn't actually happen.
Right.
And that's also not the case necessarily.
That's true. And then the third leg of the stool analogy too are those who so want a frightening experience that they perpetrate a hoax themselves by scratching themselves, which I've actually caught people a couple of times trying to do on tours.
Oh, that one is unfortunate.
It is.
So first of all, if that's your thing, please stop skewing our data.
Yes.
We're trying to do something here. Find other ways to be an attention seeker. I don't necessarily know that what also went through my head is necessarily helpful to the um, unanticipating person who is scratched and immediately jumps to the conclusion that it is a demon.
Mm-hmm.
And the potential answers could be the likelihood that it is a demon is quite remote. It could simply be an irritated ghost, or you could be the victim of a conjure. Doesn't that make you feel better?
No. Not necessarily.
No, it doesn't. And of course that opens up all sorts of interesting doors for individuals, both in terms of, as we've mentioned, and I think it's an interesting point of discussion. Ghosts are non-corporeal entities, but at times they are able to interact with us in physical ways.
Yes. Well, energy acts upon matter, and there you go. If they exert energy, it can affect matter, i.e., us.
Yeah. And what seems to be the loose ground rules for this sort of thing?
As far as these things happening, or
As far as what we can tell in terms of when it might happen, or how does a ghost manifest themselves, because obviously it's not an everyday manifestation.
right. Of course, there's visual manifestations, whether it's an apparition, anything that's halfway formed, maybe just part of a body being visible, translucent to being so detailed that people can mistake them as being corporeal. Then through, well, as we said, scratches, through moving objects. And that's something that I think some people get really frightened by when they see something moved. Typically, you don't see large items moved. It's typically small items, maybe moved across a counter or the floor or something. I have had a couple of instances where things were caught semi-levitating, and I think that those really engendered a fear response for people who witnessed the video, that something that could actually be levitated, something's not supposed to be able to do that. Although they've now been able to levitate items with sound and things like that. So within the structure of science, it's definitely possible. How it goes, does it? I don't know.
Something, and this I think brings up an interesting aspect of the cultural response to phenomenon. We seem to have sort of layers of thought. The current trend, which I don't think is inaccurate, is that ghosts utilize regional energy in order to manifest either themselves as an apparition, as a visible apparition, or being able to move something, etc. And of course, this is part of what is associated with power drain, equipment going dead, the idea that the ghost is pulling energy from the equipment in order to attempt to manifest an interaction.
True, and I think to be honest, it may explain why there tend to be cold spots and sometimes hot spots, but generally cold spots around activity, is that somehow interacting with the atmosphere itself whether it's perhaps ionizing the air or something that ultimately creates a change in temperature. Sometimes barometric pressure changes, things like that. Somehow manipulating the energy that is latent in the atmosphere.
And something that we do at least hear about is, for example, an increase of paranormal activity, for example, directly before a thunderstorm.
True. And I think that is associated with the amount of electricity that's in the atmosphere. That does seem to be a correlation.
And you all have documented an increase in observable or recordable data in association with proximity to train tracks when the train is going through. And the static electricity generated by the wheels of the train produce a massive electromagnetic field bubble that passes with the train. And then, of course, there's the correlation with the possibility that an electromagnetic field can accentuate a paranormal manifestation, but also that the paranormal manifestation can exhibit a spike in EMF.
True. The cause and effect doesn't seem to be just one directional all the time,
which is appropriately confusing. And I think that's part of the mystery. It's part of the interest, as something that is very interesting, and that you've already noted. In the 19th century, there was not the discussion of EMF. There was not the discussion of, certainly no, the potentiality of, well, if the ghosts are, for example, feeding off of EMF, they were out of luck before 1850.
True, although scientists definitely were aware of magnetism and everything then,
but we weren't just a regular fast food buffet of it, like we are now. But along with that, the idea that, first of all, that paranormal activity, as you noted, had a lot more to do with what we would think of as a visitation, as a there for a reason. And of course, that also ties into a lot of lore associated with the wronged dead, that they're attempting to get the message is associated with justice. I was wrongfully killed. I'm here to try to point out my killer. I'm here to try to lead you to my remains. That sort of thing.
Or at least, trying to show my family where the money's buried, that kind of thing.
Yes. And a great crossover of two things of great mystique. One, ghost stories. Two, lost treasure. That's always a great crossover. But it's something that we see directly implied, although not stated, with Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, is, first of all, the ghosts are trying to make a point.
Right.
That especially Marley is attempting to communicate something. And that, second, he is doing it essentially during the dark Yule season, which we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks.
Right.
But the direct idea, and this is of course coming off of our Halloween season, and something that a lot of people are peripherally aware of, is the idea that certain times of the year, Halloween specifically, that there is a thin point in the veil, and that's when the ghosts can cross over and interact with us, theoretically more so than in other times.
Very true. And that brings up the fact that people often will have a unnatural fear of, quote, the witching hour.
Right. And that's the other, in addition to Halloween specifically, the idea that the witching hour is a time when the veil thins also, but
Yeah.
on a nightly basis, theoretically.
Yes. And variously, some people will say the witching hour starts at 2 a.m., some at 3 a.m., basically in the middle of the night.
Yes.
And um, you see people expecting more violent hauntings to occur at that time. And there doesn't really seem to be a correlation with the time as far as this, I guess, the severity or how volatile the haunting is.
Which is interesting. So much of the hauntings that we've investigated are not time specific.
They aren't, or a lot of times some of the most concrete and significant activity occurs during the middle of the day. So just the opposite time that people expect. I think that probably there are people listening saying, well, why haven't you talked about possessions and attachments as things that scare people with paranormal activity? But I think we're going to talk about those a little further down the list. So
I haven't even had the opportunity to collect my Raggedy Ann dolls.
Mine is in the other room. I didn't. I should have grabbed it. But she doesn't like to be moved around. So.
That's fair. We don't want to upset her.
No. So we might switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the things that scare people that are caused by the living.
Fair. Very fair. Things, of course, that fall into that category include gangster history, serial killers, axe murderers, the classic axe murder motif of the 19th century America, because the good old days were such a safe place in which to live.
Well, I find it very interesting because there's a dichotomy with death and murder in the 19th century. On one hand, it was the time of life and death by the gun, particularly in the West, a la the Winchester House, Sarah Winchester building onto her house for 37 years to keep the spirits of those killed by the Winchester gun and rifles at bay, and the axe. And I think that if most people are asked and they answer forthrightly, say they fear an axe murderer more than someone with a gun, probably.
And it's so much more benign to be shot than it is to be hacked to death.
Particularly after you've seen it in 1,000 movies, maybe.
Of course, I would contend that increasingly pop culture displays gun violence with such a high propensity that there is a numbness to the idea that is very very disassociated with the realities of being shot.
True, but that wasn't as much the case, in the 19th century.
Certainly not in the 19th century. My proviso on that is I'm only referring to latter half of the 20th century, just in terms of cultural expectation and our obsession / horror of the axe murder, the the concept of the axe murder, which, interesting enough, has a great deal of ties with hugely iconic hauntings.
Mm-hmm.
Lizzie Borden, Villisca, and the Amityville case.
That's true, as well as some cases that were more local to the Ozarks.
Yeah, and
You know,
certainly my contention in regards to the axe as a point of horror, first of all, is all that Hollywood blood spatter, but second is, and this is something that has become removed from our culture today, because we're
mm-hmm.
not cooking with wood cook stoves. We're not typically using firewood on a daily basis, etc. But the idea is that in everyday life, from the time that one was old enough to remember, in rural 19th century, and not just rural, urban 19th century culture, the axe was not a symbol of murder. It was a kitchen tool. It was an everyday household tool. It represented hearth and home, and building a fire to warm yourself in the kitchen, and a fire to cook your food with, etc.
Right, and then that being used as an instrument of destruction and death is so, out of 180 degrees from what you're used to experiencing it as in that time period. While you were talking, I was just thinking it's funny that, of course, we have the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that we don't have the same sort of visceral fear of chainsaws, or it used as a weapon. So, of course, it's hard to be stealthy with a chainsaw, but
It is hard to sneak out, let's face it. But
it is. I take my chances
really
against the axe over a chainsaw.
and the and that's true. The certainly for our contemporary culture, the imagery of a chainsaw is simply utilitarian.
It is. On the flip side, it's often used as spook haunts to scare people.
Absolutely.
Take the chain off and start her up
and have at it. Which it is an iconic addition, and very effective, but only if you're in the dark woods.
True. Maybe. But I think your point about the axe, I think, versus the gun, is valid. That people expect violence out of the gun, where they don't necessarily expect it out of the axe, and it becomes more personal wielding the axe. For one thing, it's up close.
Yes.
You can't stand 50 feet away and well, I guess you could throw the axe, but whether you hit them is probably
that's up for grabs.
Exactly. And so there's sort of an old adage in practicing criminal law, about men tend to kill with guns, women tend to kill with knives, and people are more shot by a woman who kills, but also with the knife, because it's more personal. True.
And that definitely crosses over with the axe. Now, in I'm going to tie this back to hauntings in a moment, in terms of just our conjecture. But do you think that in some of these, obviously some of these axe murders that took place, it was pragmatic. The use of the axe was pragmatic.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, the killers in question, or the alleged killers in question, would also have been brought up with this culture that the axe was a symbol of hearth and home.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts, more in this case within the mind of our alleged or conjectured criminal, that there was a particular fascination or obsession with using the axe for those reasons as opposed to using something else?
Well, I think that it could be generally transported without raising as much suspicion that you have ill intent, particularly around a home or whatever, because you could have just been out chopping wood or whatever. Whereas brandishing a gun is going to raise suspicion more of why do why do you have a gun out in the house or whatever, people are probably going to be more on guard. And it's stealthier.
Right.
I think stealth is a big factor. And they were so common, it could be easily disposed and another one found, where guns were still relatively expensive. So if you got rid of the gun to hide the evidence, it was going to cost you more money to replace a gun than it would an axe.
True.
Plus, now here's the flip side. I'm sure for some of those killers, they probably did enjoy the personal nature of it, and probably more of a sense of control over the victim,
which is chilling. Mm-hmm. And deeply malevolent.
Yes.
And if that person ends up being associated with a haunting, that could be concerning.
It could. And, there's only one or two places I've investigated that I think that may be a possibility. But the entities there were more aggressive towards people. And that may be part of the reason. Now, personally, I find running into someone that is capable of violence like this much more disturbing than any haunting, or when we get down to brass tacks later, even a possession or something, because one, it's more common, and two, there is such a calculated coldness that I don't think people are really aware that most people are capable of. Having dealt with a handful of people in my day job that were serial rapists and had killed people, there's a palatable difference walking into a room with someone like that. And although it may seem cliche, the hair on the back of your neck standing up, and sometimes, once or twice before I actually knew what all they had done, the energy that they give off is very chilling and creates a sense of vigilance.
Yes.
Well, if you're smart, you will be vigilant. I'll say that.
Right. Yes. And it is, I think, not to freak people out too much, but as long as we're talking about what scares us, the potential for individuals like this to not only be in everyday society, but to be around us is real.
Oh, it is. And there are statistics out there that, the average person at some point in their lives will cross paths with a serial killer.
Yes.
Pass them on the street or have a conversation or whatever. Um, and most of the time you will never know it.
Mhm.
So um, I'll take my chances with a ghost anytime.
Very true. Now, which again, on so many cases, the dead are so much less frightening than the living. What, just in terms of not necessarily talking specific locations, but situations in which you encountered a more aggressive haunting that led you more to this line of thought.
Uh,
What does that look like?
One that comes to mind first would be one that involving a shadow person that is aggressive. Um, that's something that creates a lot of fear for people too. For
Yeah.
in the paranormal is shadow men, which by and large they don't bother me at all. And it's no different than if they come through as a lady in a white gown. Um, but in general, even more so than regular apparitions, shadow men tend to shy away from you and go the other way when you encounter them. Um, but I haven't encountered one where it would actually charge at you.
Yes.
And uh, I've never known it or seen it to actually sort of impact or interact with a physical body that dissipates as it gets to them, but it certainly appears to relish creating a sense of fear that somehow they are going to do that.
Yes. Which is interesting. Now, one of the mm, standard tropes, which at times appears to be true, is locations like prisons, asylums, bordellos, um, battlefields,
Mm-hmm.
that there is more violent manifestation.
I think so. And I think it's sometimes it seems that activity replays or mimics events as those people died. Um, and then situations where you have people who are, maybe mentally unstable or um, severe anger, aggressive personalities. That energy seems to be captured in the environment, whether just latently, aside from whether or not there's an intelligent haunting.
Right. And that's another thing that is just important to take into consideration, is the fact that we might be interacting with essentially echoes.
Yes, that that happens quite a bit. Actually, a lot of activity falls into that category.
And that sometimes that takes people by surprise, sometimes perhaps disappointingly, in the idea that we're not dealing with a sentient or fully aware entity, but that we're
True.
more privy to a ripple of time.
That's true. And I think that's part of that's related to just a desire to get answers from the other side.
True, true. And certainly this isn't really the fear factor side of things, but there's certainly individuals who do seek out the paranormal, specifically in some cases ghosts, to try to get answers.
That's true. That's true. That does account for a number of people who are interested. So we kind of covered things of paranormal activity, some real life monsters, human monsters, living ones.
Yes.
How about urban legends and people and their reactions to them?
Oh, there's a lot of moving parts to that. Part of our position with Dark Ozarks is often to debunk urban legends, separating out the historical hauntings opposed to the lore, the modern lore that is built up around locations that at times are not haunted at all. But certainly a number of places in Missouri in particular, well, and there is a certain amount of crossover between urban legend and folklore. So
Mhm.
locations that come to mind for me, of course, the first one that follows us around even more than the Howler is the Springfield albino farm,
True.
and which is an urban legend. The
Mhm.
location, the farm that got identified as the albino farm, is a real location, but
Right, the Sheedy Farm. Yes, it is, and has been there for a long time, and the same family owned it for a very long time. No longer, but um, and then just basically everything with the kitchen sink gets thrown in of what supposedly happens.
and as a general rule, you can usually recognize, now there are exceptions to this, but you can typically recognize an urban legend because it has a cornucopia of latter 20th century horror slash ghost tropes attached to the location.
Right. It sounds too good to be true.
Yes. Now, a caveat to this is that there are certain geographical locations in which a great deal of diverse paranormal activity appears to manifest.
True.
Spooklight Road is one of them.
Yes, it is.
And there are other locations throughout the Ozarks that and outside of the Ozarks that do that. But if you pay attention, what you typically need to have your antenna up for is, does it just sound like a series of tropes layered one on top of the other? Does it sound like
A Scooby-Doo episode.
Does it sound like a Scooby-Doo episode? Does it sound like 3 generations worth of fraternity and sorority kids making things up to initiate the next round of students?
Pretty much. And the albino farm fits all those bills, including, obviously an albino that never existed who
Yes.
carries the cats, by the way.
Of course it's an axe. it Now, I would be interested to, the internet has kind of screwed this up, because now urban legends can be shared non-geographically.
Yeah.
But I would be very interested to look at we'll just pick the 1980s and look at existent urban legends and their proximity to universities.
Yeah, and a lot of that really started in about the 1960s, it seemed, of which, of course, corresponded to a time period where a larger percentage of the country was going to college.
Yes. And Now there is an interesting sociological dive here that I'm going to make,
Mhm.
which is this also corresponds to a time in which modernity is exercising the paranormal or the supernatural from daily modern American life.
Yeah,
And this is also interestingly, the college students who appear to be exhibiting this as a rite of initiatory passage are representational of the American demographic who are they themselves the most modern.
that's true. So almost unconsciously seeking out what they've unconsciously rejected.
Yes, which I think is a continuing theme that you see in modernist culture. I also wonder on a subconscious level, though I don't think that this works, but I'm just wondering if this isn't a push, that the motif of being afraid of your urban legend. It's
Yeah.
the scary albino farm with the guy with the axe. It is Zombie Road with the witches. It is
Mhm.
the witch grave. It is, you name it.
Right.
That first of all, that these are being perpetuated as rites of initiatory passage.
Hmm. And and generally just the kids, which
Yes.
is the funny thing is, like when you talk about the spook light, a lot of it could be applied to the spook light as well, except for the fact that objectively something does happen there, it's caught on camera, etc. And it wasn't just a teenage rite of passage. People would take their families out there. So
Vastly different in the fact that it's multi-generational.
mhm.
Now I'm going to use the O word, and by that I mean occult. There the I don't usually use the word occult, and an important note when I do use the word occult, I am using it in its accurate sense, which means hidden knowledge.
Hidden or secret knowledge, yes.
And there is an occult aspect to these fraternity sorority initiatory passage rites. It's
Right.
these types of things, and by I'm not implying magic, but I'm just looking at it from a very common sense standpoint. A college student who's being initiated,
Mm-hmm.
this is not an environment in which mom, dad, grandpa and grandma, aunt, uncle, cousin, and little brother and sister are a part of.
Right.
And in the case of the spook light, it was and is on occasion.
Yes. You
That's
know, it might just be teenagers at times, but it is
Mhm.
the other a lot and has been for a very long time.
Yes. And
Much
to
much
me,
more a communal experience.
yes. And to me, that coupled with the fact that it is consistently observable, albeit unknown phenomena, really places Spooklight Road in a vastly different camp than, say, Zombie Road, which
Yes.
that is actually an interesting counterpoint, particularly considering that they're on opposing ends of Route 66 in Missouri. On top
It
of
is the Ozarks too.
that, yes, and but now here's my conjecture, and it is only conjecture, but in terms of these initiatory occult practices,
Mm-hmm.
it could be a subconscious attempt to face the paranormal, in this case, the alleged or artificial paranormal,
Mhm.
the hoax paranormal, and then emerge out of that as the modernist.
I think that works at the beginning stages of the urban legend
Mm-hmm.
as the story is being made up, because then obviously even the ones telling the story, they know they're making it up. And even for a time period, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, there's still a knowledge in there somewhere that you're hearing this, but it doesn't sound like it's really true. But now, how many times has, say, the albino farm been brought up, and when the person is told it's urban legend, there is real disappointment because they really did think it's real.
Yes. Well, I didn't say that subconscious wasn't going to go off the rails.
Because it becomes its own psychoses.
Yes. But that is a very good point, which is, it is. It's, oh, darn, you mean that's not real? I wanted to go get frightened by the albino axe murderer.
Because everybody does.
Doesn't everyone? And with that,
It's
now,
just a good Friday night. What's Friday night if you're not chased by an albino with an axe, you know?
bring the popcorn. So with, now here's a question. I've never actually explored this just as a topic. Was there, or is there, a paranormal legend or expectation surrounding the quote unquote albino farm?
There never was, but um, what I hear from kids now, college kids and so forth, is they expect that it is haunted.
Right.
And expect that now it is the ghost of the albino.
Mm-hmm.
So recognize the albino's not there, but his ghost must be. I get that a lot. And it's
Okay.
So it kind of has moved from, you had this albino and all of this, to, well, it's gone on long enough that obviously he's probably not still there, so he's haunting it.
But now
And
it's a ghost.
right, so when you burst that bubble, they're really disappointed. And then the other thing that I get a lot from people who are interested in it is they aren't sure where it is. And when you say Springfield Farms, they look at you strange. And yeah, because that's what was built on the farm now. And they're disappointed. But so it has become an expectation that there's a haunting and that they can go find this ghost.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the idea of sending the initiate to go find the ghost, or or interact with the witch's grave in some way,
Yeah.
Is a recurring motif. And it is associated with fear.
It really is. Now, one thing I've always been fascinated with, this fascination with witches' graves, which tend to grow up around a tombstone with a more poetical epitaph on it, is I have yet to hear a witch's grave story of anything happening.
Very good point.
I've never heard where the witch appears, her apparition appears, something happens, but they go find the tombstone and read it, and then that's the end of the story. And it's like, how are you that fascinated by this?
It is deeply anticlimactic.
It really is, but they keep going and are compelled to still go because of the word witch, I think.
The word witch is compelling in the American psyche.
It is, and scary to a lot of people. It really is.
Right. And for much of the same reasons of that sense of potential powerlessness. Here is an alleged person who could do something to you, and you don't have a defense.
And even the interest in it, to the point of maybe going and looking for the gravestone, at least subliminally admits the possibility of magic.
It does. There is an association. So now the question that I have is, for an individual who is seeking out the alleged witch's grave, what do they expect? I mean,
I'm really not sure. I mean, I kind of envision hocus pocus, and what do they think if the Sanderson sisters show up?
Yeah, could be a bit of an issue.
Exactly.
I think for me, and again, this is pure conjecture. I've not specifically talked to someone about their goals, dreams, and ambitions in regards to visiting a witch's grave. But I think potentially for some, especially in the category of the initiatory rites of passage in modernist society, is facing down the fear, or facing down the fear of the unknown, the supernatural, the primitive, the idea.
It's a forbidden fruit. I mean, let's face it.
True. Now, and running off of that motif is also, especially as an interest in neo-paganism, Wicca, etc., has risen heavily, is that a witch's grave could potentially be seen more as a shrine, and along the lines of Marie Laveau.
Yeah, I do think that you have to kind of put, say, the veneration for Marie Laveau in a separate category, because it seems to me, at least in this area, witch grave stories, it's not, people don't tend to come at it from the perspective of New Age witchcraft and veneration. It's touching that's that scary possibility.
Yeah.
And I am still waiting for someone to say something happened at any of these witch graves. If someone has that kind of story, let us know, because I want to hear one, because they all of them are disappointing, because it's like, we went out to the witch grave and nothing happened.
Right.
They read the tombstone. Or they couldn't figure out which grave it was.
That's always a problem. And coming back to the poetic inscription on the witch's grave, this is largely, perhaps not exclusively, but largely tied to a misunderstanding that, especially in the 19th century, these types of highly poetic and introspective, even of a wee bit mystical inscriptions, were not uncommon.
No. And I think in part it's probably a misunderstanding of of the conception of spiritualism in the Victorian age.
Mm-hmm. I
And,
think that's very fair.
and since we are so dull in our tombstones in the 20th century, in the 21st century, name and date usually only. Anything that is poetical and tends to rhyme. Now, here's this may be where the New Age witchcraft comes in, that they mistake it as a spell.
I think that is fair, and you know, truth is we probably have Shakespeare to blame for that, unfortunately.
Double trouble and all.
Yes. Just used only for dramatic purpose. It, but it does make for, I do. I think that's a very accurate read. And it also speaks again to this modernist disassociation with death, the shift to the idea that graveyards are creepy places. You go to the graveyard, and to me, this is increasingly just an alien concept. You know, the urban wayfarer wandering through the rural graveyard, imagining that the poetry, the oftentimes beautiful inscribed poetry, is some sort of incantation, that you're in the forbidden land, you're engaging in some sort of forbidden association, it's all terribly spooky. And 50 years prior, this is where the school kids went and had their picnic.
Very much so, and that's something that is lost. Cemeteries generally, that there's something else that people are afraid of generally anymore, are cemeteries. And
Yes.
whereas traditionally in America they were for the living, and as you said, they have picnics or whatever.
And one of the reasons that so many traditional cemeteries are so beautiful.
Yes.
And that the trees that were retained or out of the landscape, or the trees that were planted there, were done so because they were beautiful. And it was in addition to being a cemetery, it was also a park.
Yes. And that sense really has been lost, and I think in part because of the invention of television.
Fair. Very, very fair. And this is a jumping segue, but we mentioned it briefly. Maybe well worth talking about this before we jump directly into inhuman entities. Is there are a number of paranormal associations or phenomena that, according to the individuals who've experienced it, was associated with personal terror,
Mm-hmm.
and was also associated with UFOs.
Very, very fair. Sense of paralysis is one that comes to mind. Not being able to move or to flee, that kind of thing, comes up in both instances.
Yes.
Something communicating with them.
Yes. The idea that there's some sort of telepathic connection.
Yes. Also comes up with cryptids sometimes, with Bigfoot. That is a emerging theme that is seen more and more, that there's a telepathic communication with cryptids.
Yes.
As well.
and or we're using our own created pop culture references in an attempt to explain a phenomena that we really can't explain.
True. Now, one thing with UFO experiences it seems to me that they aren't discounted more than they were, say, 30 years ago, but they don't seem to engender the same level of fear as they used to overall for the general population.
That's true. I think, and perhaps I'm only speaking for myself, but I do think that pop culture strongly influences our responses.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time that the 1950s, 1960s B sci-fi films were released, although we would watch them and see them as very hokey, when they were originally being viewed, they were oftentimes seen as pretty terrifying.
Well, War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1939 is a good example of that. People really took it as a real news broadcast. And then I think things changed through the 90s and early 2000s, in large part, again, pop culture through the X-Files.
X-Files, yeah.
I think a lot of people, came to the conclusion that these are possibilities, that ET exists, that there are visitations, but somehow it's become a little more demystified, if that makes sense.
And yeah, I think that's fair. And I would place, in terms of public consciousness, the point counterpoint. There's several overlapping point counterpoints, but one being well, I think the best one on this linear space would be War of the Worlds as the radio broadcast to Independence Day with Will Smith.
Yeah.
And definitely bookending two very different perceptions.
Yes. That's very fair. One, all doom and gloom, chaos. Two, there is a way to react.
Yes. And how can you not, enjoy it because it's the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air?
Of course.
But I've spoken with a number of individuals who have shared their UFO experiences, and something that was striking to me, there's certain individuals who it's very non-paranormal, for lack of a better word. I am in this location, I am seeing a craft.
Yeah.
And what is weird about it is the way the craft is moving, or the number of them and the way that they're interacting, or the shape of the craft, the appearance of the craft. It's weird.
Right.
But in terms of how they personally feel, nothing has changed, in the sense that it's no different than if they were looking at a weird helicopter and they're going, wow, that's a weird helicopter. I don't know what to make of this, but I'm not being impacted by it.
Right. Doesn't change the worldview.
The comparison, like it could rationally, you could be saying, okay, wow, there's new technology, or maybe it is an alien, and I have to look at things differently. But there's, in a separate category, there's a number of individuals I've spoken to, often quite credible, that, for example, and the best way of describing it is, I was looking at the craft and I felt what could possibly be described as a kind of telepathic connection.
Okay.
that it, not that I'm watching a phenomena,
Right.
but that it is aware of me,
Mm-hmm.
and my response to this is possibly paralysis, sometimes terror. It is a life-changing experience because something about this is different. I'm no longer an objective observer. I'm somehow being engaged by this phenomena.
That's true. That there are those that have those experiences.
And to me, I've not had that experience, but to
I
me,
haven't either.
that's terrifying. That description is terrifying.
That would be, and I've had an experience, but not like that.
Right.
So yeah, I can see if that were the impression they have, that it definitely would be frightening. Although there are similar sort of experiences with various cryptids and so forth.
That share a similarity in that idea.
Yeah, that kind of experience that they are aware of the observer, and the observer can't explain how they know that.
Yes. And often that it is a very unsettling idea,
Yeah,
or space in which they find themselves. It's very uncomfortable, it's very frightening. And then there are a number of cryptid sightings that it's simply, oh look, I saw the thing,
yeah,
and the thing was weird, but again, like the personal experience, no different than seeing a white-tailed deer, only it's not a white-tailed deer.
exactly. And there's no way to qualify that, for analysis. Yeah, that's
No.
the frustrating thing. There's no way empirically to account for that.
Right. And that is by de facto, that is problematic in terms of objective data, but it does happen, and it happens frequently enough, and with witnesses who oftentimes are very credible to understand that this is something out of the ordinary. And I think worth noting, and again, coming back to our topic tonight, things that are scary, uh an interdimensional outer space craft that seems to be sentient and recognize that you saw it,
Yeah,
and be able to telepathically interact with you in a way that you know that it knows that you know that they know.
meanwhile, that most people are not going to believe you when you tell them too. That
Right.
layer on top of it, that
Yes.
would be terrifying.
That all the way around. Pretty much a deconstruction of one's position and where one sits in reality.
But
Which
most people will be ready for a rubber room at that point.
fair. So for the individuals who are not and have managed to hold it together, our hats off to you.
Yeah. Now,
Yes.
probably the most frightening thing that people are scared of.
Demons.
You said the D word.
Well, it's after Halloween. I'm just feeling carefree.
There you go.
More specifically, as a collective whole, inhuman entities.
Yeah.
But nothing really gets people's attention like saying the D word.
That's right.
And as you noted earlier in this episode, we really can trace all of this back to the exorcisms.
Pretty much. There really wasn't much discussion of demons or possession, even in folklore, very much up until that point.
No.
Granted, I mean, the subject existed, and and the rite of exorcism has been around for at least 2,000 years, and probably much longer in oral tradition. But it wasn't something that was in the public mind.
No. And I think in terms of esoteric lore, prior to The Exorcist, demonology was definitely more of an occult practice and science in the genuine sense of the word.
Yeah, it definitely was secret knowledge, that held by a small number of people, which, to be perfectly honest, in the scheme of things, Pierre Blatty deserves a lot more recognition for his literary skills in writing The Exorcist than I think he gets, because of the effect he's had on society.
Agreed. And it was a monumental moment in pop culture,
Mm-hmm.
and in popular consciousness, not just culture, but in consciousness. At the same time, it might be fair to say that we have this deluge of an idea, this flood of an idea that breaches into public consciousness, but very little context or actual occult lore or data behind it. So we're really left somewhat adrift.
Really have been, and I think that accounts for a lot of the almost irrational fear that people exhibit just at the drop of the D word or possession, etc. I think that the pop culture has left the sensation that these things are more common than they are, and can happen more easily.
Yes.
Than they do.
Typically, the idea is that it can happen very easily, or even without the person's awareness of it.
Right. And granted, these cases do tend to start more subtly. Again, you don't have, sort of the Beetlejuice kind of entrance of, hello, I'm here. But it is so rare that it's almost a given that if you think you're dealing with a demon, you probably aren't. But if you really think so, you really need to get in contact with people who deal with that specifically.
Not us, by the way.
Not us. And there are plenty of paranormal teams who say they deal with these things. There are a handful of paranormal researchers who are actually demonologists, very few, and then certain clergy.
Yes.
And beyond that, I think that if you are dealing with something along those lines, someone that is a hobbyist coming in with sage and a Bible, saying that they can bless your house and it will take care of everything, is a very foolish path to trod.
And it comes, unfortunately, we'll just call it, I think, certainly as I see it, it comes with an enormous amount of arrogance and hubris. And if you are dealing with an ancient inhuman entity, those are not good places from which to start.
No. It brings up something that happens in discussions in the paranormal field a lot about is there such a thing as an expert? Well, by and large, most people say in the field will say there is no such thing as an expert because there's so much that's unknown.
Mhm.
There are veteran researchers, there are people with a lot of experience. Experts per se, no. However, when you're dealing with something like this, there is a level of expertise that you really want someone to be dealing with this so that you don't end up with a worse situation.
Right. Right. And as a note of balance, the positive thing is that in almost all cases that people think that they have a demon, they usually don't.
Exactly. Now, the flip side is The Exorcist actually does refer to a case with ties to the Ozarks.
It does, or specifically St. Louis in
Yes.
1949. And for people who should be aware by now, but may not be, is that a portion of the St. Louis metro is within the Ozarks proper. Consequently, St. Louis metro as a whole and historic cities like St. Charles are within that Ozarks borderlands region. So there is definitely a tie. And shout out to Stephen LeChance's book, Confrontation with Evil, the 1949 St. Louis Exorcism. Great documentation
Yes.
on this. And you've had the opportunity to interview Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen and I are friends, and I've interviewed Stephen several times regarding the case as well as his book, and ironically have had odd things happen during the interviews when he's talked about certain things. Not not trying to scare anyone, but it's certainly a little odd. In particular, we were doing a podcast and our producer was in Texas, who initiated the three-way call between me and Stephen. And Stephen was in St. Louis. I was here in Joplin. And in particular, Stephen was getting ready to discuss visiting the rooms that had been occupied by one of the priests from that event, who had been basically housed at the Letsing Brothers Hospital from 1949 until his death in the early 1980s. And the Jesuits had sealed the rooms physically and by prayer. And Stephen, and I'm not going to give it away for people because you can read the book and he tells you what happens. But as he's about to discuss what happens as he's approaching those rooms, the line goes dead with the producer, but Stephen and I are still talking.
Yeah.
And that happened in two different interviews, by the way.
Interesting. And I think, and this might be a good place to conclude. First of all, encouraging people to check out Confrontation with Evil by Stephen LeChance, available on Amazon and possibly other locations. I got mine on Amazon.
Yeah.
And also his introduction to the potentiality of the demonic was in Union, Missouri, with a specific house.
Yes. That also ultimately was certified as a demonic haunting. And he did not come at it as with an interest in the paranormal or knew anything about the house. He rented the house for he and his children after his divorce, and basically found himself in the midst of this haunting. And it had quite an impression on his life, that ultimately he walked away from paranormal research because of it.
Yes. And now I have not read the book yet. He did write a book, published a book on the Union Screaming House.
Yes. Actually, there's two, The Uninvited and I just went blank on the second one. But that does detail the events at the Union Screaming House.
Right.
One thing that he strongly discourages people trying to get into the house. He's approached by people who ask him to see if he can get them in there, and he's quite frank. He doesn't have any ties to the owners, and he wouldn't if he could anyway, because it is a dangerous circumstance that should not be approached lightly.
Right. And that is very fair.
Mm-hmm.
Which, on all things scary, could be a good place to conclude.
I think you're right. That's probably about as scary as it gets, is the personification of what you watch in The Exorcist.
Yes, it is. So with that, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise on darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and the Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on the next episode, we'll be discussing writing, specifically our books and more. Thank you to everybody. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.